Incorporated did not work on Shabbat.
What's that?
The Murder Incorporated gangster.
Oh, there you go.
They did
There's-
not
there's-
they did
there's
not work on Shabbat.
Right, there's a whole tradition. Right, why not? I can see that, like, you know. There's a certain, I mean, even today, I feel like there's certain understandings about, like, gang violence ought not to happen on a Sunday morning. I think that's got in the,
Well,
in
that was
the
in the wire,
wheelhouse
that was in the
of
wire, that was in the
being
wire.
respectful. Yeah.
In July, they had a moratorium on Sundays.
Well, we're a little bit, unless that's, we're a little bit early, so, I mean, do you want more break time, or are we feeling like we're ready to jump in?
Go for it.
Because it might snow in 12 hours.
Is that what you think everybody's
Yeah, you gotta go
nervous
buy- you
about?
gotta go buy some
Let's go.
Yeah.
That's hilarious. That's hilarious. So I will ask, you know, I intended to talk to Jim Goodman lately, because I'm a little worried, I think he's been having some health issues. I talked to him like a week and a half ago or so, but I haven't been able to connect with him since. So anyway, but I do know that Ellen had been riding with him, and,
Oh, they have my number.
what's that?
Her daughter has,
She does?
I gave
Okay.
her daughter my number and she knows, I don't think I have her number.
Well, maybe
Zena-
after
I think
class we
Zena's on-
could.
And
I
I
think
said-
Zena's on top of this.
She's been trying, because she hasn't been in a couple of weeks. I know she
No,
tried
she
to
was
Uber a
here.
couple of weeks ago.
No, last week she was here and her daughter then came.
No, that was 2 weeks ago.
No, that was a while ago.
That was in the small room.
Yeah, it
Oh,
was
yeah,
2
I'm
weeks
sorry.
ago.
So
Yeah.
she, oh, so.
Well, anyway, if you're willing to reach out to her and offer a ride,
I probably need her phone number.
okay, after class, I will give it to you.
I asked
Yeah.
Zena, and Zena said she checked and she didn't want to ride.
Oh, okay.
She, I would already.
Okay, so maybe she wasn't available tonight. I just want to make sure that if she wants to be here, we can maybe try to help her get here. All right, wonderful. So this class is, Miriam and I talked about the classes tonight. It made absolute sense for her to go first because she was really talking about Shabbat observance writ large and talking about sort of the comments, the concept of Zachor and Shamor, like these two different ways of connecting with Shabbat, the more affirmative, the things that we do in a positive way on Shabbat that are maybe we're not as attentive to the rest of the week, right? Did you talk about some of those kinds of things? What were some examples? Maybe talk about Zachor. What are positive things that we do on Shabbat?
It wasn't framed that
Oh, you
way.
weren't framing it that way. Okay, so how did you frame it? I'm curious.
We had a list of different activities that we got to circle if we thought they would be Shabbat appropriate for us.
Ah, okay, beautiful. So-
And then we had a discussion, and then we looked at the same list
Mhm.
and said, with what we know now and how we have had this discussion, would the list, the things that we circled change?
Ah, very nice. Okay. So classically, the version of the Ten Commandments that says Zachor et Yom HaShabbat, right? Remember the Sabbath day, is the positive commandments that have to do with Shabbat. So it would be things like studying and praying and eating and making love with your partner and those kinds of things. And the Shamor et Yom HaShabbat, the guard Shabbat, is associated with the 39 melachot, those 39 categories of specific labor that are connected with what? The Mishkan, the tabernacle, okay? And I think there's actually a list of them in your rhythms book.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we're gonna be focusing on one, on one category, perhaps, maybe a couple of categories, in talking about driving on Shabbat as our class together. But before we get there, the other thing I want to say, and this kind of brings us to our enduring understanding, what we believe about God in Revelation has ramifications for how we aspire to believe to behave rather in godly ways. So last week, if you remember, we did our second session on theology and what was it called again? And Revelation. Is the Torah revealed word of God? And we talked 2 weeks ago, we focused more on the kind of classical, what we consider today Orthodox understanding, traditional understanding of Revelation as coming from Sinai and written law and oral law. And then last time we talked about different thinkers within the different movements about how we think about Revelation. And today, we're gonna kind of put that in practice. We're gonna say, okay, believing that the Torah was given in its entirety on Sinai, both the written version and the secret decoder ring oral version that goes along with that, has real implications for how we interpret Jewish law. Okay, the Hebrew word for Jewish law is what? Halacha, which means to go, right? But if you believe that the Torah was revealed in its entirety on Mount Sinai, what are you going to say about halacha?
That it can be modified, or can be changed.
Well, actually, I think the opposite, right? If
Oh, the
it was
opposite,
revealed entirely
yes.
on Mount
Because
Sinai,
it can't be.
you're going to say, well, therefore, halacha is inherited and static. And any interpretive process is only about teasing out what God meant exactly when God revealed God's word on Mount Sinai. But if you believe that halacha, that God is in process, or that perhaps the Torah was not written, is not exactly the word of God, but maybe is inspired by God, or it's a human document meant to try to understand the will of God by human beings, a holy act to be sure, but not divine in origin, then what would you believe about halacha, for example?
Negotiable.
It's negotiable, that it can change, that it can evolve, that it would change with the times, that things that were legislated thousands of years ago may or may not apply to today, right? So when we come to Shabbat observance, that's going to be a really critical question when we try to understand, like, what's the difference between a normative Orthodox perspective on Shabbat observance, a normative Reform perspective on Shabbat observance, and perhaps a normative conservative version. Those are the three we're going to talk about this evening. Okay? Sound good? Any questions up to here? Thoughts? All right. So let's jump in. I actually want to do, very, very briefly, I want to mention the Reform and Orthodox positions. And that's not because they have less to say at all, but because I actually I think it's in the conservative movement in particular that the question of driving on Shabbat becomes more interesting. Why? Because if we're to summarize the Reform position, what do you think it would be?
If you want to.
So maybe it has to do with individual choice, and I agree that's a really central to Reform ideology. And more than that, what else?
People don't live right.
Okay, so it has to do with modern, and it has to do, well, let's look at page 119, and I just want to see, would somebody read the last paragraph here from Rabbi Jonathan, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, Roman, Faith and Practice. Someone want to read that as mentioned above? Yeah, go ahead, Nate.
All right, as mentioned above, traveling is not forbidden, provided it is for a purpose in keeping with the Sabbath. This applies to all people and not just those who are too infirm or live too far away from their destination. Nevertheless, it is also pointed out that traveling is often associated with tension. Be it crowded buses, running out of petrol, or being delayed in the traffic jam, whereas walking can be more peaceful. Choosing to walk might also be a way of differentiating the Sabbath from other days of the week, and so for these reasons, rather than the traditional one, that turning on the ignition creates a spark and so desecrates the Sabbath. Walking should be considered as an option where appropriate. However, this does not undermine the original principle that in Reformed thinking there is no intrinsic objection to traveling by car.
Okay, so what's central to his thinking on whether or not to drive on Shabbat?
Stress.
Meaning, how does it feel? Right? Shabbat is supposed to be about rest. It's supposed to be, as Heschel says, a palace in time, right? A world apart from the world of the craziness of our lives. So if something feels not Shabbistic, right? If something feels like it is work, then you ought not to do it on Shabbat. But if something is not really work. It doesn't feel like work, even if maybe classically it was called milacha, it was called one of those 39 prohibitions. That's less important because what, like turning a key in an ignition and driving, like that's not necessarily work, but maybe, you know, doing so like on country roads is relaxing, but in bumper to bumper traffic is not. So it's less about driving per se or starting an internal combustion engine per se, and it's more about the experience of rest on the Sabbath. Right? That's going to be the kind of normative reform decision. Each person should choose, each person should make an informed choice, and that choice should be largely related to the overall ethos of Shabbat, which is about rest. Okay? What about the normative Orthodox position? So this is going to be, you know, pretty easy to ascertain, but it's going to be what?
Thou shalt not.
No, why not?
You're igniting, kindling.
Right.
Combustible engine.
Because one of the 39 prohibitions on Shabbat, one of the 39 melachot, is not to start a fire, right? It's not to kindle a flame. And when you turn the ignition in your car, you are igniting a spark which creates a chemical reaction, and it is fire. There really is no way around that. It is called an internal combustion reason for a reason. And since fire is the thing that is, what's that?
What about Tesla? Tesla.
We'll get there at the end. I'm burying the lead a little bit. But that is, right, like, that is why it's called that, and therefore, it doesn't matter. And so what does Rabbi Chaim Donin say? One second. Objections, look at 127. Someone want to read the first full paragraph there? Objections do come.
Objections do come from those who are not total Sabbath observers in the first place, and who move a great distance away from a synagogue and then self-righteously proclaim their inability to get to the synagogue unless they drive there.
Okay. So what's his position?
You know,
Don't move away from shul.
Yeah, like if the problem is that in this day and age people live far from their synagogue so they can't get to synagogue without driving, move closer to a shul. Like that's not God's problem, right? God didn't make you live in the suburbs. God didn't make you live in the suburbs where there are sidewalks and you're 5 miles from the synagogue. Like God said you shouldn't light a fire on Shabbat. So what are you doing moving so far away? That's your problem, right? Not Judaism's problem. Okay. Okay. Now, so we come, and I wanted to start with that because when we get into the tshuva, the infamous in some circles, driving tshuva of 1950.
So in the modern era, and certainly, you know, because actually, what would happen if you're from and you don't have a lot of money and you can't live in a neighborhood where you just logistically cannot, it's not a choice.
Okay.
Even though he may say it's a choice, but, you
Yeah.
know, but what's the response on that?
Well, but I mean, there are lots of synagogues in in Park Heights.
No, I understand, but let's say, for example, not here, but perhaps, in other places.
San Francisco.
So he does actually respond to it.
Yeah.
He would say, it is perfectly permissible to daven by yourself.
Yeah, okay.
Right? One does not have to pray with a congregation. And if you are in a situation where you can't, get to a synagogue, I'd be hard pressed to, like, most Jews are observant in that way. They're making choices to live where other Jews live and in walking distance. But fine, if you find yourself, so you pray at home and you create the most spiritual experience you can at home. But there's no requirement to be in a synagogue. That is just an added bonus, he would say. Okay? But I think what's behind your question is also what's going to be behind the question of the responsive on the Sabbath that we're going to look at. But before we do, and we're actually going to spend a bunch of time in our class today in Chavruta reading through that tshuva, that responsum, and I want you to actually spend some time thinking about the concepts that are raised. But in order to get there, I want to unpack the traditional sources of prayer. So let's look at page 132. And I just want to kind of go through these together relatively quickly so that we have a concept of when we get to the driving tshuva, what were some of the sources that they're drawing on in order to make their case? Because oftentimes, those who want to cast aspersions on the responsive on the Sabbath, and it is one of the most maligned modern responsa that's out there. They'll say, well, it's not a serious tshuva. They didn't really take the law into account. I think there are aspects of it you can quibble with, but you'll see, actually, no, these were serious guys who very much took the law into account, and they were making some real choices based on their understanding of the law and based on their assertion of the needs of the current society in which they were living, which is mid-20th century America, okay? So let's look at some of these sources. I'm on page 132. Someone want to read from the Mishnah? What's the Mishnah? It says right there, compilation of teachings 3rd century BCE to 3rd century CE, Eretz Israel. Who wants to read it?
If a person removes a corpse on a bed into the public domain, he is culpable. Rabbi Shimon declares him exempt.
Okay, so there's a lot there. When we say chayav and patur, right, or poter, what are we saying? So when we say someone is culpable, that means that they are guilty of violating Shabbat, and if someone is patur, they are not guilty. Now they're still guilty, but it's not the same level. You don't have to bring a chatat. You don't have to bring well, actually, you do have to bring a chatat. If you're patur, right, the second version of it, where it says exempt, you are exempt from being. What is the punishment for violating Shabbat? Death, right? Death. So you are exempt from being executed. You still have to bring a sin offering. Right? A sin offering is what was brought in temple times when you violated a mitzvah and did so unintentionally. Okay? So these are just two different levels of guilt, but they're going to kind of, if somebody is patur, there's more wiggle room in terms of what's permissible. Okay? The word for totally permitted is mutar. That's the technical term. Okay? But patur is just, you don't have to be stoned to death. Okay? And then the other question we want to ask is, what are we talking about here? So one of the 39 milachot is that you are not supposed to carry or transfer on Shabbat. Right? Raise your hand if you're familiar with this concept. Right? What's the basic premise? What does it mean that you're not supposed to carry or transfer?
It's work.
Okay, so it's considered one of these 39 categories of work, and what is it specifically?
It's into the public domain.
Okay, so there's one thing is about moving something from a private domain into a public domain, or a public domain into a private domain. A private domain, an example of that would be your house. Public domain, street, right? And another aspect of that is carrying. And what is carrying? Also, but here you're within the same domain, right? So within your house you can carry, but if you're in the public domain, right, even if you're not transferring something from the public to the private, let's say that I'm walking along the street and I see, somebody drop their teddy bear, right? A kid dropped their teddy bear on the sidewalk. I'm not on Shabbat permitted to pick up the teddy bear and move it more than 4 cubits. Okay? That's carrying, okay?
This is why we have the string.
That's the error.
So the Eruv is a legal fiction that creates a shared private domain so that you and I can walk a casserole over to each other's house on Shabbos.
Yeah.
Right, or walk our children over to, okay, so we're not gonna get into Eruvin tonight and all the complicated, because this isn't about all those different, all 39 melachot, but the important concept here is the purpose of violating the mitzvah, violating the commandment, okay? What's the issue? If you're removing a corpse, okay, if you're taking a dead body on the bed from a private domain to a public domain, the first opinion in the Mishnah says that person is chayav. That person is culpable for the death penalty because you've done what? You've carried, you've transferred, you've moved the body and the bed from the private domain into the public domain, and that is forbidden on Shabbat. The opinion of Rabbi Shimon is, no, you're patur. And why would he say you're patur? Well, let's look at Rashi, okay? Someone read the next one? You don't have to, if you can do the Hebrew, great, but I'm happy to help you with that.
Because it's a malacha she'eina tzricha legufa,
Okay.
a labor performed not for its own sake. And any labor that is performed only in order to move something away is considered a malacha she'eina tzricha legufa. Since he did not will it or need it, it does not constitute a creative act according to Rabbi Shimon.
Okay, so when I want to go to my friend's house for a Shabbos meal, and they say, hey, could you bring a bottle of wine? And I walk out of my house carrying my bottle of wine, and I walk from my private domain into the public domain, and I walk down the block, and I walk into Sally's house, and I say, look, I picked out a nice Merlot that we're going to have, right? I am culpable for carrying on Shabbat, assuming that there's not an Eruv. Okay, I'm culpable for carrying on Shabbat. Why? Because my full intention in taking the bottle of wine from my house into the street and then into Sally's house was to take the wine to her house on Shabbat. Like, I knew what I was doing, that I was transferring that from private domain to public domain. Okay? If you are moving a body out of your house, are you doing that in order to transfer something from the private to the public domain? No. Why are you taking a body out of your house?
Because, if it's starting to decompose.
You could imagine a number of, probably it's not that, but you could imagine a number of reasons. It's going to be about kavod hametz, it's going to be about honoring the dead, it's going to be about beginning the process of, like, there are all kinds of reasons, but none of them have to do with carrying on Shabbos. Like, if you're moving a body out of your house, there are all kinds of reasons, none of them have to do with transferring. Okay, and because of that, Rabbi Shimon says that the whole point of that, like the whole point of that prohibition on Shabbat is about observance of Shabbat. Since you're doing something that has nothing to do with the observance of Shabbat, it's permitted, right? Certainly you're not going to be held culpable for it, okay? And there are lots of examples of this notion of malacha she'eina tzricha legufa, that you're doing a malacha, you're doing one of those 39 prohibitions, but you're doing it in a way that it is not representative of the purpose, right? Another example is like if you're, if you put out a candle, a fire on Shabbat, you're not supposed to extinguish the flame, but if it's like,
Burning your house.
if it's like, well, not if it's burning your house down, definitely you should put it out because then it's pikuach nefesh, then it's threatening a life, right? And if you're saving a life, that trumps everything on Shabbat. So let's just assume that it's more about like filling your house with smoke, right? And it's going to fill your house with smoke and set off the smoke detector, and that's going to bring the fire department, and that's going to sort of create, like, it's not going to actually burn down your house, but it's going to be a real problem. Some authorities would say you can extinguish the flame because you know that if you don't, it's going to create all kinds of tsuras. Okay? Not because you had any intention of extinguishing a flame on Shabbat, but because if you were allowed to keep going, it would create problems. Okay? That's an example of it. Does everybody understand that? Malacha she'eina tzricha legufa. Okay? All right. Any questions about that?
Seems there's a very fine line drawing here.
Oh, yeah.
Well,
Well,
halacha is all about fine line drawing.
Absolutely.
That is, the Gemara stretches from here to the wall, like for a reason.
Yeah, but it's beginning to sound like the reform justification of driving. What's the purpose of your driving?
So it's interesting, so reform authorities who will say this, they are within certain aspects of the difference being, though, that it's not about sort of the individual experience, it's about the collective experience, like understood norms, and, it's not just about what feels
Well, I understand
for
you
you
move
or
the
for
line,
me.
you can move the line along that
Yeah.
continuum, but it's the same justification. And what is the,
There's
so
some
you have to look
of-
at the
there's some of
purpose of the work, if you will, not
A little bit,
not the inherent act.
So look at Tosfot. So Rashi, we know, lives in the 11th century in France. Tosfot are Rashi's grandsons and others who lived in that sort of that generation. And somebody you want to read, it seems to Rabbi Yitzchak, because they're now going to, Rabbi Yitzchak is going to be one of the Tosfot. David, you want to read?
It seems to Rabbi Yitzchak that the classification Malacha Sheina Tzericha L'Gufa applies to any labor that is performed for a purpose other than the one that it had in the Mishkan, since it is the purpose for which it was performed in the Mishkan that determines the essence and root of the Malacha.
Okay. So we have a disagreement about what this Melacha Sheina Tzericha L'Gufa means. Rashi says what? The thing that you don't need needs to be what?
He said only if it's, only, it says to move something away.
Yeah, but what is Rashi,
The
according to
object-
Rebbe Shimon, trying to understand why Rebbe Shimon says that
Oh.
that you're exempt, what is Rashi's explanation for Rebbe Shimon not making you chayav mita, not making you culpable for the death penalty for moving a corpse?
You're not doing it for yourself, you're not doing it.
Yeah, that your intention in doing it was different from the normal uses of,
Yeah.
of what you would
Moving
do,
dead body.
right? So if
Or
you're,
you didn't will it.
what's that?
You didn't need it, or you didn't will it.
Yeah, you didn't need it, you didn't want it, it doesn't matter, it has nothing to do with Shabbat, it's just something that happened to be a Shabbat violation. But it's sort of judged in the moment. What's the difference between that and Tosfot's understanding?
Yes.
Yeah.
Seems like it doesn't take the circumstance into account, just say any labor performed for a purpose other than the one.
Other than what? The one it had
Yeah,
where
in
and
Mishkan.
when?
In the Mishkan,
In the Mishkan.
yeah.
Right? In other words, they're sort of originalists, right? The
Yeah.
important thing here is what the original purpose of it was. So it doesn't really matter what, like, we have this sort of, all right, like, give you an example. There are some people who would say you should pre-tear your toilet paper before Shabbat. Right, ever seen that?
Oh, yeah.
Right, or you get used, napkins, different things. Right, why? Because tearing is a violation on Shabbat, right? But Tosfot might argue, in that context, that no, the prohibition isn't against tearing, because when you're tearing toilet paper, right, a Rashi understanding of Rebbe Shimon would say, if you tear the toilet paper, as long as you're not tearing for the sake of, your intention wasn't to tear, your intention was to, do your business. And therefore, tearing the toilet paper isn't a problem. Tosfot would agree that you're not culpable for tearing the toilet paper, but what would they say?
Do something preventative.
They would say that the tearing of the toilet paper has nothing to do with the kind of tearing that was prohibited. in the
Yeah, but when they were constructing the tabernacle thousands of years ago, it had nothing to do with toilet paper or tearing toilet paper, right? It had nothing to do with tearing paper. It was about, right, you're not allowed to tear or to sew because it was about writing a Sefer Torah, or about, to write certain documents, or about killing an animal in order to take the hide to make, right? All the 39 prohibitions are actually fall within 4 separate categories of labor that were connected with the way the rabbis understood the construction of the Mishkan. And again, you have to sort of read it through the rabbinic lens, because those 39 melachot are not so clear in the Torah, but at least the rabbis read the Torah, they understood that. So we're now, when you tell me that you can't, that when you eat watermelon, you have to like take a bite of the watermelon and spit out the seeds, instead of picking the seeds out of the watermelon, because there's a prohibition against borer, which is separating on Shabbat, they might say, wait a second, there was no watermelon in the Mishnah. The whole point was about separating for those particular purposes, okay? So that's kind of the backdrop of this, okay? And that's the reason we're learning it now is it's going to be important when they do this tshuva on response on the Sabbath, okay? All right, any questions about this? Otherwise, I want to do just a few more minutes on this. All right, let's go to the Bavli. We're on 133. Someone want to read from text A2. This is from the tractate Bava Kama. Yes, Aaron.
In the case of one who buys a house in the land of Israel, the deed of sale may be written even on Shabbat. Could this really mean that one might do so on the Shabbat? Surely not. Rather, just as Rabbah explained elsewhere, that we ask a Gentile to do it on our behalf, here too we ask a Gentile. And even though telling a Gentile to work on the Shabbat is a shivut,
Yeah.
Shvut,
Is what you hear in the yeshivish world.
a rabbinic Shabbat prohibition. The rabbis did not prohibit it here in order to encourage the settling of the land of Israel.
Okay, so first of all, we need to understand, there are prohibitions that are considered Torah-idic and rabbinic. And which one is worse? Torah-idic, right? So if you violate how would I say this? I'm trying to think of a good example. Kidneyot on Pesach, right? So kidneyot, eating legumes on Pesach, right? There's no prohibition about eating legumes. That's a rabbinic, Ashkenazi rabbinic interpretation that was meant to create a kind of fence around the Torah and protect you from maybe confusing flour, because you might get your rice flour mixed up with your wheat flour or other kinds of things. But that's a rabbinic overlay. Everybody admits that's rabbinic. There's no prohibition against eating peanut butter or kidney beans or those kinds of things. Okay, so there's the Torah-idic prohibition would be eating bread, right? That's forbidden clearly, but eating legumes not so much. Okay, so in this particular instance, they're talking about something that's shvut, which is a rabbinic Shabbat prohibition, and that specifically is this notion of a Shabbos goy. What's a Shabbos goy?
Someone who does work for you on Shabbat.
Exactly. So they would say, rabbinically, you're not supposed to instruct somebody who's not Jewish to do something on your behalf that you wouldn't do yourself. So what's the legal fiction? Warren McFarlane at Beth Am Synagogue really likes coffee. So every Saturday morning, he makes like 2 pots of coffee for himself. Just in order to have coffee. But now that he's already made the coffee, if Carol wants to come to shul and drink the coffee, it's fine because Warren made it for himself and he had a lot of leftover. Right? But if Carol shows up and says, Warren, you forgot to make the coffee, go make me a cup of coffee, that's prohibited. It's not biblically prohibited, but it's rabbinically prohibited. Does that make sense?